Hello. You are about to listen to an interview with Jules Gill-Peterson, conducted by me, Isla Hansen, for the Center for the Arts and Society at Carnegie Mellon University. Jules Gill-Peterson is Associate Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. She earned her PhD from Rutgers University and has held fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies and the Kinsey Institute. She was honored with the Chancellor's Distinguished Research Award from the University of Pittsburgh in 2020. Jules is the author of Histories of the Transgender Child, University of Minnesota Press, 2018. This was the first book to shatter the widespread myth that transgender children are a brand new generation in the 21st century. Uncovering a surprising archive dating from the 1920s through 1970s, Histories of the Transgender Child shows how the concept of gender relies on the medicalization of children's presumed racial plasticity, challenging the very terms of how we talk about today's medical model. The book was awarded a Lambda Literary Award for Transgender Nonfiction and the Children's Literature Association Book Award. It was named one of the best transgender literature by Susan Stryker. Jules has also written for the New York Times, CNN, The Lily by the Washington Post, Jewish Currents, The New Inquiry, The Funambulist, and more. She has been interviewed extensively in The Guardian, CBS, NPR, and Extra Magazine. She also serves as a general co-editor at TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly, and writes a regular Substack newsletter, Sad Brown Girl. Jules is currently at work on several projects: the Trans Girl Lyric, an unconventional memoir that defiantly says no to how our culture treats trans women of color; a Trans Woman Manifesto, a short accessible book for activists and scholars on the devaluation of trans women by both anti-trans and generic pro-trans politics; and Gender Underground, a history of trans DIY, a book that reframes the trans 20th century not through institutional medicine, but the myriad do-it-yourself practices of trans people that forge parallel medical and social worlds of transition. This interview is part of the Objects of Play lecture series, made possible by the Play Mountain Exchange project, directed by me, Isla Hansen. This is a Borderlines Initiative project sponsored by the Center for the Arts and Society at Carnegie Mellon University, where I am currently an assistant professor of art in the School of Art. The Play Mountain Exchange is a collaborative research and art-making project that explores play as a lens and mechanism for seeing, thinking, and engaging across cultural borderlines. In the following conversation, I talked to Jules Gill-Peterson about some of the ideas and histories shared in her book, Histories of the Transgender Child. This conversation serves as a prelude to Jules' talk, scheduled as part of the Objects of Play lecture series, taking place over Zoom on Wednesday, March 2nd at 9:30 a.m. So join us live then for Jules' talk and a Q&A session. Jules' book, Histories of the Transgender Child, tells a history of trans childhood, race, and medicine. In her book, she argues for a radical reckoning with the ways that the concept of childhood, binary gender, medicine, racism, and capitalism have transacted unbelievable degrees of harm in the name of care, guardianship, development, and pedagogy. This conversation may contain, as Jules' book does, some extremely difficult stories to hear or read about children, especially trans children, being used as, quote, living laboratories, and children being killed, harmed, or institutionalized at the hands of doctors. This conversation may also include references to self-harm and suicide. But despite that the history laid out in Jules' book can be read as a sort of genocide, there is also a lot of hope in her book. One of the most hopeful moments I found in the conclusion is about Louise Lawrence and what Jules found looking through her correspondences. I am actually going to ask Jules to tell us who Louise is and what her archive means to her as my first question. I also want to share with listeners that I come to this conversation and I came to Jules' book through the lens of research I have been doing surrounding play. I was looking for books about play and the development of trans kids, and I found very little. And I also feel very strongly that the numerous laws we see going into effect banning trans children from playing sports in ways consistent with their gender identity are human rights violations, and they are not always being talked about as human rights violations. I wanted to share that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 31, states the following: States parties recognize the right of the child to rest and leisure, to engage in play and recreational activities appropriate to the age of the child, and to participate freely in cultural life and the arts. There are currently 10 states in the United States with laws in place that violate this article, keeping trans kids from important developmental activities such as playing sports. So I think play, something so important to child development, is at the center of the radical reckoning Jules calls for us again to reckon with the ways that the concept of childhood, binary gender, medicine, racism, and capitalism have transacted unbelievable degrees of harm on children. Play is a space where the most violent of norms are being upheld, including on the playing field, on the playground, and in the classroom. But play can also be the space where a child or adult is able to self-recognize, self-identify, or self-express, either playing alone or finding oneself through playing with others. Or at the very least, play is a leisure space where one finds community and safety. And that's not the least at all. So Jules' talk on March 2nd will touch more directly on issues surrounding play and trans kids. But for now, this interview is an introduction to some of the ideas in her book that are important to understand about the history of trans children. And one more not small disclaimer is that throughout this interview, Jules or myself may talk of, quote, the trans child as if there's one story or person or singular experience. But I want to address off the bat that, of course, literally every single person's story and experience is different. There is a broad, wide spectrum of stories of trans childhood if we could really know them all, especially, as Jules notes in her book, across racial lines. To paraphrase Jules, the definition of children's transness should not be easy to grasp. It cannot be a stable, singular concept, but its reality is an internally diverse field of experience. And this is an important point. It shouldn't be just a disclaimer. Jules says, the multiplication of what transness means is an urgent project for trans children's livelihoods. So, in the spirit of that, we will also be discussing some specific trans people and their experiences. Without further ado, here's the interview recorded with Jules Gill-Peterson on February 9th, 2022. So Jules, thank you for being with us here today. My first question for you is, who is Louise Lawrence, and what type of community and network was she able to find, foster, and create through her correspondences? I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about the series of photos that Lawrence received from, quote, B, that you write about in your conclusion. What do these photos mean to you and to the archive that you strive to sort of find and create in your history? What does it mean to wish that there be trans kids?
And in some ways, even though this collection of photos comes at the very end of my book, it's kind of the ideal place to start. So thank you for starting us there. And Louise Lawrence is this really interesting person that not a lot of us know about. She was a trans woman who, in fact, transitioned completely on her own without any particular medical or social support in 1944. So, actually before the 1950s, before the sort of celebrity of Christine Jorgensen and the kind of arrival on the scene of a certain trans visibility. And so she's from an older generation, and she was really kind of a networked sort of community kind of builder. And so although she had to figure out how to live in the world as a woman on her own, she hardly did that by herself. And so she had a really vibrant kind of lived in community of different kinds of trans people in the San Francisco Bay Area that she cultivated. And, they would get together and have parties and strategize and, kind of help each other out navigating the challenges and the dangers of everyday life. Because, Louise herself had to figure out how to get a new social security card, how to work as a woman, how to do all of these things and pass in everyday life without the benefit of hormones or surgeries, which she wasn't really personally interested in and which were pretty much impossible to find at the time. And so Lawrence is kind of this really networked figure who also has this incredible correspondence group. So she's writing letters and trading letters with other mostly trans women all over the United States and in some ways around the world. This is a really common kind of practice for trans people in this era to keep in contact, to build kind of pen pal relationships, confidants, and really kind of bare their soul and collect stories, share stories. And one of the things that I really love about that is it dispels the myth that, trans people, say in the mid 20th century, would have lived sort of lonely, isolated lives, and that they would have been kind of sad, depressed people without access to community or without a way to understand themselves. And so on the contrary, Lawrence sort of shows us how much trans people kind of, especially trans women, will just build their own community and build their own world if the world around them isn't welcoming. And so, Lawrence left this beautiful archive to the Kinsey Institute, which I had the chance to consult while I was working on my book. And in that, she had tons of just sort of photo albums, some of pictures that she had taken, but also pictures other trans people had sent her. And this too was another way that trans folks in this era kept in touch and shared pictures of themselves, usually, mostly actually. It's really kind of lovely. And so you have these really interesting photo books that are kind of a difficult primary source in the sense that, it'd be like if I picked up your family photo album, right? If I know you, sure, I might be able to place some of the names and some of the events, but otherwise, what do we have to go on? As researchers, we sometimes have captions, we sometimes have dates, and, basically you have to become an encyclopedia or a sort of like literal Facebook in order to understand who all these people are. And so anyways, there was a kind of pile of photos that came to her from someone who just went by the initial B for anonymity and protection. And it was a series of photographs of a parade on Long Island, in, I believe, the 1950s. And it's this really interesting collection of photos that, showcases kind of an everyday scene. These were sorts of parades called mummer parades that were, pretty popular on the East Coast, the kind of Philly, New York, tri-state area. They still happen to some extent. And, they were a kind of ritualized, publicly sanctioned parade where people were allowed to cross-dress, right? And it was understood to be a form of costuming. And of course, pretty much every culture has these kinds of rituals. And so they're not pictures of trans people, they're just pictures of kids and adults dressed, cross-dressed for the day, having fun, smiling for the camera. And on the back of one of these photos, that's a picture of a child, B has written this sort of enigmatic caption that says budding transvestite with a question mark and has sent it to Lawrence. And I really loved this because I think it speaks to something really difficult and actually deeply stigmatized and taboo in our culture, and a huge stumbling block to understanding how to welcome and lift up and affirm and even just live with and respect trans kids. And that's actually what I call, in the conclusion, wishing or desiring that there be trans children in the world, not merely accepting that there are some and trying to produce all sorts of careful guidelines and structures to regulate how many there are, or try, as we're seeing so often today, either to extinguish them or do everything we can to prevent kids from being trans. And then if they're still trans, okay, fine. But actually to understand that it's good and desirable for there to be trans people in the world, and that those people have to grow out of childhood. They have to come from children. There's no other way to make us, right? And so what I love about this moment is that we go all the way back, to the mid 20th century, and we see in the trans community evidence of that very thing that I'm asking us to reckon with today. And I love that the photo is not of an actual trans kid, right? It's very obviously not a trans kid, but by B captioning it budding transvestite, surely tongue in cheek, she's really sort of testifying to the power of saying, like, it would be okay though if that kid happened to grow up to be trans. In fact, it would not even be okay, it would be welcome. And she, if that child were to grow up to be trans, they would come into a world that welcomed them, in a world with elders, a world with adults, and a world that understood them as having something important to bring as people in this world. And so I just think it's sort of a beautiful, it's kind of like a meditation from the past. And it's really, in some ways too, a challenge to us here in the 21st century. Like, not only do we have a lot of work to do to protect and love and care for trans kids, but look how belated we are. This is already something that trans people have figured out so long ago. It's us who are out of step with the march of history, not trans people, right? And so I think there's something really sort of powerful about how such a small moment in the archive can really call our entire culture to account.
Yeah, I loved that in the conclusion, and it was such a good way also to remember part of your mission and wanting to create this history leads into my next question, which is that you have this mission to tell this history of trans childhood, partially because there's a belief now that there's something quote new about trans children and that they have no history, which of course you prove so wrong. This allows people to deny the lives of trans people who have lived through history and allows people to think in this newness there is something wrong or something that could be easily snuffed out before it has risen. Can you explain how treating someone as unprecedented likely results in doing harm to that person, as you describe in your book?
It's a true central strategy of anti-trans politics and movements today. In fact, I was just reading this morning for some writing I'm doing about the history of trans misogyny, an anti-trans feminist group in the United Kingdom that submitted a legal brief or a sort of summary of their position to the UK government, which has for many years been stalled out trying to reform the Gender Recognition Act in that country, which is the act that governs the very limited prejudicial ways that trans people are able to change their name and their gender marker and other really life and death kind of bureaucratic decisions. And it's no joke, in this document, this anti-trans feminist group literally says, trans people only exist because of a couple of strange social conventions. And they're not even joking when they say this. They say there are only trans people because of pornography and because doctors let people cross-dress and because of laws like the Gender Recognition Act. And so according to them, social engineering could eradicate trans people. And so, really in what, no matter how ridiculous that is, right? Obviously, it's part of a real political strategy that would take away human rights. But it really rests on this assumption that trans people just showed up, that we're new to the party. And this is probably nowhere more kind of prevalent than when it comes to kids. It's pretty commonplace to see, even in ostensibly kind of neutral or journalistic sources, this sort of, well, we've just not been talking about trans kids before. There's something really new about them. Isn't it all just about Generation Z and how obsessed they are with social media and diversity and inclusion? And you see all these sorts of kinds of ridiculous arguments that like watching anime makes kids trans, or that there's some sort of epidemic level of people, young people identifying as trans. And of course, none of those things are true empirically, but when we think about what kind of rhetorical strategy and political strategy it is to frame an entire minority group of people as unprecedented, means that you can do precisely what that anti-trans group did: cast doubt on their reality and make the case for their planned eradication. I mean, it really is the logic of genocide. And in some ways, children, are maybe not surprisingly the principal targets here, because of course, we already imagine in our culture that children are unfinished in their identities and their growth and their development. And so trans kids have really become sort of the absolute target of these kinds of campaigns, both because I think, there's a way that people can cash in on the cultural newness of trans kids in mainstream public culture, right? I think it is true that for most adults, unless they already know trans people in their lives, this is probably the first time they're turning on the TV, they're logging onto social media, or they're hearing political candidates go on and on about trans kids. That's a new cultural level of visibility, but it's easy to mistake and actually pretend that that cultural visibility has some sort of empirical reference. And so that's, I think, the sort of strategy that's being seized upon. And so, yeah, like you said, for me, it's so important to have history. And because history is one of the most undeniable, unimpeachable ways that we can reply, no, enough of this entire rhetoric is untrue and absolutely needs to stop. And so for me, being able to point to trans kids having a modern history, a continuous history with the present day that stretches back a whole century, is one powerful way to interrupt that genocidal logic and say, there is no appropriate amount of trans kids in the world. There is no particular novelty of anything going on today other than transphobia. Transphobia has never been higher. Today's transphobia is unprecedented, but history allows us really to kind of turn the tables on that prejudicial thinking.
Yeah, it's really interesting also the way it's like not until the word can you have an anti the word, right?
Yes.
So it's like with the codification of the language becomes the haters, right? And it's like that's what's new is the level of hate, right?
Well, and that's kind of, I think, been one of the big lessons that particularly Black trans women and trans women of color have been explaining to us for a long time now, right? That visibility, recognition in language is not some, inherent good process. It trains the spotlight on us. It teaches people how to look for us. And if people are hearing a term for the first time, then they're going to assume that that thing is new because it serves their, entrenched interests. So yeah, I think really, again, there's also this kind of cautionary tale about how much our culture celebrates visibility or how much kind of trans inclusive or gender diversity politics today and best practices stress that like, it's amazing, language is so good. We have all these great terms, they're gonna set us free. And it's really, never really been trans women and children who have benefited from that process, which doesn't mean language isn't important, but it does mean we need to be a little more complex, I think, in our public conversations about that.
So I think my next question is really complex, but I'll give it a try. I'm wondering if you could explain the separation of sexuality as object choice from gender as identity and the problem that gender's emergence marks that you talk about in your book. You talk about this idea that gender has this lesser known root in a conservative historical context that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, and as you write, associate with the feminist movement. But do you see this more conservative lineage related to how the term gender is understood today? And can you explain what we've lost in framing queer and trans childhood with these terms? How in Catherine Bond Stockton's terms, as you write, should the queerness of the concept of the child radically undermine the neatness of the division? Is it through the trans child that we can really best understand what trans means and is and can be? Those are my words in the end. That's my question.
No, I love that. I mean, I think broadly speaking, it's not through the trans child that we can best understand what being trans means or what it could be, but that is in fact what trans kids have been used and really abused in order to establish, questions that seem innocent enough. Where does gender come from? Where does being trans come from, right? But the same kinds of questions that were applied to proto-gay and proto-lesbian kids. Where does sexual orientation come from, right? And whenever these terms are being asked, they're not actually being asked innocently. They're being asked with a kind of motive of, well, if we find out how, maybe we can intervene into that process and stop it. Or at least at the very, at the least harmful, influence it and shape it to our own adult ends. And both of those, I think, are very disturbing. They have very disturbing kinds of histories because this really has happened in the history of medicine. And so, one of the things that I think is difficult and troubling for us today is that, in this climate of homophobia and transphobia, this kind of cultural backlash politics in which I think, a lot of people have felt not just burnt out or exhausted, but actually a little jolted, startled, feeling like things are, by their estimation, sliding backwards. We've really, found out together how vulnerable some of our kind of, 101 postulates really are. Like this idea that, if you go to an LGBT ally training, what will probably be the first thing you're told? Sex and gender are different. And that's also different from sexual orientation. None of these three things have to go together in any particular way. And, that's a specific cultural definition of those three terms specific to the Western world, really the United States, in a largely middle class, predominantly white context. And so, one of the things I like to say, just as a matter of fact, it's a deeply ethnocentric way of defining sex and gender and sexuality. And these are not innocent terms. They're not just identities. Sex, gender, and sexuality were main planks of not just settler colonialism in the United States, genocidal attacks on indigenous peoples and eradication of two-spirit, gender systems, but also just in general, the labeling of indigenous people as sexually deviant or gender aberrant, right? It has also been a central plank of anti-Blackness in framing of the descendants of slaves as hypersexualized or sexually available to white people, and has been a very central plank of global projects of colonialism over the last several centuries. So, the idea that we just show up and we have sex, gender, and sexuality as separate, to me, just already raises a lot of red flags. But when we actually look into this history, and this is part of what my book takes up in a more narrow sense, I think we just find that actually things might be kind of opposite, right? So the idea of sexuality as object choice is sort of a queer theory way of talking about it. It's sort of this language that comes out of 1990s scholarship, and the idea that, your sexual desire is sort of indicated by the gender of the person who is the object of your attraction, right? So if you're heterosexual, your gender object choice is the so-called opposite gender. And if you're homosexual, your gender object choice is the so-called same gender, right? And that's supposed to be different than your sense of gender as your own interior identity, right? And of course, that's really complicated to maintain. There are plenty of people who I don't think would agree with that definition. And historically, it hasn't really held. And going back even further, this distinction between sex and gender wasn't invented by feminists. It wasn't invented by trans people. It wasn't invented by queer people. It was invented by very conservative psychologists and psychiatrists. And this is the medical history that I tell in my book. One of the main places this theory of gender as an identity was invented was Johns Hopkins Hospital. One of the famous people responsible for it, who, many of us probably heard of before, is the psychologist John Money, right? Who really comes up with this idea that, okay, well, basically that, your sense of being a man or a woman in his eyes is something that's formed very early in life, but that it doesn't really necessarily follow from anatomy or genetics or any of the other biological aspects of the body. And that's, for him, a piece of data that's had been well established by, at least a half century of observation of humans, but, actually centuries of evolutionary and biological data. He was very frustrated by this, right? Doctors and psychiatrists wanted what we think of as gender identity to follow one-to-one from what we think of as the sexed body, but it just didn't. They couldn't make it work, right? And so they're sitting at the middle of the 20th century with this crisis. They can't predict, based on someone's body. And I'm not just talking about genitals, I'm talking about gonads, I'm talking about endocrine system, I'm talking about, secondary sexual characteristics, talking about any number of biological data points. They cannot predict how someone will grow up to think of themselves. And they cannot force people to grow up into one sex or the other. And so they're in a big kind of quandary because they don't want people to be intersex and trans and queer. They want people to be, normatively or binary sex, right? And so the concept of gender actually arises as a solution to this crisis. It is not an emancipatory thing, right? Money coins the idea of gender simply to say that, well, someone's identity seems to be formed somewhat like their first language. There's maybe some sort of biological priming, but there's some sort of cultural input that's needed early on in life. And once that input is established, you basically can't change it, right? So Money will say, sure, once you're 25 years old, you can learn a second language, but will you ever sound perfectly fluent as if you were a native speaker? No, you'll always be obviously bilingual. And he says, by analogy, same with gender, right? Once your gender identity has been established as a young person, doctors could force you to try and live as a different gender, but you'd never really be able to pull it off because it goes against who you are. And so basically what gender does is it moves the goalposts of normalization. And it says, great, if we want to force people, their sense of their identity to match their body, we have to force it on them as early as possible in life. And that's all it is. Gender emerges as a new clinical strategy to force intersex children, to basically align their body with one or the other social gender roles in the world. So the sex gender distinction is not this big feminist stroke of genius, although feminists do seize on it and try to make something out of it, because for them, they're like, oh, great. if sex roles aren't biologically determined, then, women don't have to actually be inferior to men. There's no biological reason. Sure. But, as for the rest of this baggage, I mean, this sex gender distinction is used basically to torture intersex children. And it's used to force trans people to transition only in order to pass, right? Because after the invention of gender, basically the medical impetus and then the legal impetus and the social impetus to make sure that your body matches your identity only increases. So in some ways, things have become more conservative as a consequence of the sex gender distinction. And so to take that back to the question of, trans and queer kids, right? I think one of the problems there is that, beginning in the 1970s, gay politics really tries to separate itself from trans people. There is this trans exclusionary history to gay liberation, right? But then in 1973, gay liberationists are able to get homosexuality demedicalized, removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And one of the ways that they're able to depathologize homosexuality is to intensify the pathologization of gender variants, right? So they really basically sell out trans people to secure their identity as gays and lesbians, because to them, being gay and lesbian is being a normal man or a normal woman. Even though the history of gays and lesbians is deeply bound up in gender variants, we see this sort of process of shedding that and excluding trans people to separate it. So really what I want people to think about is sort of like, our cultural separation of sex, gender, and sexuality, and our cultural separation of lesbian and gay from transgender, right? These are huge, vast historical projects that are still ongoing, but they have a lot of collateral damage. They're not authored sometimes by the people we think that authored them, right? And so it doesn't mean like, oh, gender is useless and we could never use it for, good political ends. I'm not trying to say that, but I do want to sound a note of caution that when we think that these things are our salvation, we might be wrong. And I think the way that we know we might be wrong is that anti-trans people and actually homophobes are constantly using the sex gender distinction against gay, lesbian, and trans people. See it literally constantly. There are over 100 state legislator level bills this year being passed by anti-LGBT organizations, evangelical groups, white supremacist groups, and Republicans that basically take advantage. If you go and read these bills, read the committee testimony, they all take advantage of the distinction between sex and gender, often to argue that gender, because it's quote unquote socially constructed, is actually made up and useless, and we should only go on sex assigned at birth in order to, make policy. So, again, these things that we think have sort of perhaps kind of emancipated us may actually also be our Achilles heel. And to my mind, since they have this deeply conservative, violent medical history, it's not clear to me why they are our preferred means of organizing or our preferred means of visibility. We might simply pick other concepts for explaining what we call sex, gender, and sexuality.
Wow, thank you. I think so in there you use this term passing, and I think my next question kind of relates to this idea. And there's this quote from page 191 in your book: "The trans child today promises the future stealth adult of tomorrow." And in some ways, this sums up a lot of the critique in your book. And I'm wondering if you could unpack this. How do you feel puberty suppression therapy, a form of transition at an early age, is aimed against those trans people who transition as adults? Do you feel there is a stigma against adult transitioning as lesser version of transgender, as you note in your book, because it could produce more visible trans difference? And what's the risk of erasing trans visibility here? And how does this reinforce and strengthen sex and gender binary? And then a follow-up, as it's constantly discussed in your book, is how does racial plasticity play into this question?
That's a great question, and one that sort of honestly lands a little differently almost 4 years after my book came out, because here we are sitting at a moment when there are active moral panics around childhood transition, around things like puberty suppression, and at least one state, actually more than one state, has banned children from accessing these forms of care. And so, of course, in some ways, what I'm getting at in the culmination of my book is of course, I'm down to critique those, horrific conservative moral panics, but I also am levying a critique against the kind of liberal inclusion model of transness in the way that it has framed trans kids. And I actually think that this critique is just as relevant today, maybe even more, because I've been very disappointed in watching people try to mobilize against these bills targeting children, that they don't really know how, because we have a really narrow concept of valuing trans kids. And one of the ways that they have been valued, and this is sort of really what that line from the end of the book is getting at, is that there was a certain kind of interest on the part, I think mostly of some medical providers who, I'm sure were very well-meaning, but felt really excited that, if you pause puberty before it sets in, right? And then when you unpause it, because that's the normal thing to do with puberty suppression medication, and then you add cross-gender hormones because you want to transition, right? For most people who transition that way during adolescence, it's highly likely that the results of their transition will be super passable, right, by our culture's definitions, right? And in some ways that have never been possible for people who transition as adults, right? One of the big holy grails is height, right? As a proudly tall trans woman, I wouldn't take that back for anything, but it's really fascinating to think that, for some people today who have the privilege of accessing this form of gender affirming care, they might be able to adjust things like heights, but they'll also be able to avoid, importantly, developing certain, secondary sex characteristics that can provoke a lot of anguish, dysphoria, and suffering, right? And so, for some transmasculine people who pause puberty, they may not eventually even need top surgery, or they need a very minor version of top surgery, things like that, that are really, kind of interesting and important. And so it's not the fact of that, it's actually how that was being interpreted by adults, how that was being interpreted by certain medical providers. They were excited to think that, wow, in the future, no one will know who's trans, because this, in their kind of utopian imagination, all trans youth will get access to healthcare and will all be able to transition this way. And so they'll grow up to be stealth, which is to say, people won't know they're trans. And there were a couple kind of, journalistic documentaries that sort of made this point and tried to kind of cloak trans kids in that way. And I think really sort of unfaithfully or unethically represented their stories to that end. And so that really bothered me, right? And it bothers me not because I think there's anything wrong with transitioning as an adolescent, on the contrary. It bothers me precisely because I think people should be free to transition as an adolescent. But one thing we know, is that, like, first of all, most trans youth don't have access to these things, even less do now than when I wrote those words. Plenty of people will not realize they're trans as kids. People will continue to transition as adults. But I was worried how this kind of investment in the future passable child, this sort of perfectly moldable child, the super plastic child, would then be wielded against trans adults, especially against trans women, right? Who, just for reasons of hormones, the difference between estrogen and testosterone and how they affect bodily development, it can be much harder for trans women to pass without giving them access to other things they might want, including facial feminization surgeries, for instance. And so, I was worried that this kind of rush to normalize trans kids in this very narrow kind of medicalized framework would actually continue something I talk about in the book, right, which is the eugenic history of medicine in trying to normalize people and make them normal, not because that's always what they want, but because that's what we think is best for society, right? And so that there's this kind of unintentional logic at play that suggests that it's best for medicine to help bring about the end of visibly trans people. And that worries me. I don't think it would happen, right? I mean, and of course, the incredible kind of growth of non-binary identification, and those sorts of things, I think, of course, would ensure that that wouldn't happen. But it doesn't matter to me whether or not it happens. I'd be much more worried about that being the logic animating the medical field, because I do think that, erasing trans visibility is part and parcel of the project of erasing trans people, right? And that's not to say that there's anything wrong with passing or going stealth. I think it's a thing that's very complicated and socially regulated and is perfectly normal to desire. But I would much prefer that option to be left in the hands of trans people, as opposed to be sort of being behind the machinations of the medical community. I think it's sort of important to hold that in mind, even as we're sort of understandably worried about the people banning this healthcare in the first place. But it's like, as I've been arguing in my defenses of trans kids in the public, it's like, even if we defeat all this legislation, these bills, well, then we get back to what? This square one where this other concern still hasn't been dealt with. And so I do think that that's important. And, I don't think trans people reinforce the sex and gender binary in any way. But I do think that the people who try to control our lives, including doctors, psychiatrists, policymakers, et cetera, they do try to use us, right, in the service of a sex and gender binary that can hurt us and hurts other people. And so in that sense, I do worry about basically how these developments in trans medicine get interpreted by the powers that be, and how that is taking power away from trans people once again. And so the question of sort of how racial plasticity figures in there, I think, is a pretty complicated one, but maybe this takes us to the next question, and maybe I'll let you ask that.
Yeah, I think also you kind of are leading us here by virtue of talking about the use of trans children by medicine, right? And how that was seen, fantasized, sort of. And so that brings up this term plasticity. So this term plasticity is a term used again and again in your book. It has sort of two sides, right? On the one hand, quote, the racial plasticity of sex and gender was a decidedly disenfranchising object of governance from the perspective of trans children. In other words, as you say later, this idea of plasticity is leveraged against children for value extraction. But on the other hand, plasticity in its living form, how there might really be some plasticity to a body, is kind of calls us to re-examine whether we can hold on to any binaries at all. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about this doubleness as a way of defining this word plasticity.
I think doubleness is really helpful, right? And it helps me preface what I'm going to say with an important caveat. Well, it's not even a caveat. It's just sort of an advisory. This concept is really slippery on purpose, right? So as we're talking about it, and people are listening and digesting it, if it feels slippery, if you're feeling like you're chasing after it and it's eluding you, that's what it does, right? I mean, plasticity is probably a term most people are familiar with today in the field of neurology. We talk a lot about neural plasticity or neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to remap, reform, build new connections, new synaptic connections, and truly sort of change its morphological form over time and in response to input and events in the real world. This is one of the kind of, important ways that we're trying to give a concept to understand how the brain learns, how the brain adapts, how the brain responds to injury, right? And sort of the resilience of the brain, but also its vulnerability over time in illness, but also just sort of, in everyday life. But plasticity is a concept that has a really long history, and it has a history in sex and gender. It has a history in the field of endocrinology, in the fields of plastic surgery, and really all of the fields that produce forms of gender medicine. And what's really helpful about plasticity, let's start talking about doubleness here, right, is the history of trans kids and the history of trans people will help us explain something that people might not have considered, right? If you're not trans, you've probably had some kind of healthcare, right? Or some kind of what we might call gender affirming care in your life, right? Maybe you've been on hormone replacement therapy. Most hormone replacement therapy is not prescribed to trans people, it's prescribed to cisgender women, right? It's very common around menopause or, conditions like PCOS or, any number of endocrine kinds of conditions. If you've taken birth control, right? All of these sorts of different kinds of treatments, men who have taken testosterone, there's just an ever increasing number of low T clinics around the United States, fertility treatments, all of these sorts of things, right? All of these rely on the idea that the human sexual system and that our gender is plastic in some way, that it's able to change form over time. And in fact, it just normally does, right? And we know this from a really basic kind of way of thinking about it, right? We have puberty, right? When you're born, you're not sexually mature. There are several kinds of organs on your body that haven't even grown yet, right? And, plasticity really describes the sort of capacity of the body to then grow over time with the right input, with the right hormones, with the right nutrition, right? Things like that. Over time, your body will essentially normally change qualitatively in its sex, even if you're not trans or intersex, right? That's just true of everyone. But the only reason that we know these things and the only reason that we have hormonal medications and other interventions into human sex are because of studies on intersex and trans people. And so this concept of plasticity was actually derived out of experimentation on intersex children first, and then later trans children and adults. And really, basically, when I talk about plasticity, I'm talking about this thesis that comes from the biological sciences, from the field of endocrinology and medical practice, that says that, human sex is malleable. It's plastic, like truly like the word plastic in general, right? It can change form. And it changes form, like I said, on its own normally, right? But you can also then intervene exogenously through medication, through surgery, right? And you can change how the body grows in a sexed way over time, right? And those changes will be different depending on when they happen, right? And so that's like why when we were talking earlier about puberty suppression, that's a really, significant intervention into plasticity because you can actually pause puberty, right? And then switch the hormonal balance, right? To have one kind of puberty instead of another, right? But the same thing would be true again of like birth control or, perimenopausal and, postmenopausal treatments and things like that. And so basically what ends up happening is gender and sex, the actual binary, here's our second form of doubleness, rely conceptually on the idea of instability. And this, I think, is the kind of big brain stretch of my book. In some ways, trust me when I say it took me years, pouring through decades of scientific and clinical research records, reading hundreds and hundreds of books in the history of science and medicine to try and come up with a way to describe this process. So let's see if I can do it, right? But basically, right, we have this idea that, okay, sex, gender, there are these binaries governing them, right? We like to think of them as stable categories, right? Okay, you're either male or female, you're either a man or a woman, right? And we think of them, even if we don't think they should be, understood as binary, we understand that they have been represented that way. And there are all sorts of obligations and coercions in life to force us into one box or the other. And some of those are medical, right? I mean, it begins with what's written on your birth certificate, which is not really a medical assignment, is truly just someone looking at genitals, right? But throughout your life, you're subjugated by one box or the other. And so we tend to think, oh, well, the problem with the binary is it's so stable. It's about stability. It's about being one or the other. And it is. But the weird thing about their history is they actually bank on the opposite also being true. They bank on their plasticity. The idea of a sex and gender binary counts on the fact that sex and gender are unstable at a certain period in life early on. And so this is the really weird story that my book tells, is that you see all of this scientific and clinical research, for the first half of the 20th century and for a little bit into the post-war, dealing with intersex and trans kids, because they're like, oh, these kids are really plastic. Oh, they're too plastic. Uh-oh. The original kind of possibility of the human body to become male or female or both, right? Well, it's supposed to resolve by the time you become an adult. You have to become one sex, right? And so it's okay to be plastic for a certain period of time, but that has to end. And so we've got to figure out ways to force their plasticity into one mold or another. And so that's how intersex and trans kids really get sort of punished and forced into a medical model. But at the same time, science and medicine love this concept of plasticity. They love the instability of sex and gender because they can use it to change bodies. This is how we know how to change sex medically, right? It can really be done. You can change your sex, right? And the only reason we know how is because of this history of the sort of medicalization and scientific research into plasticity. And so one of the weird things about the gender and sex binary is that actually it depends on the idea of the opposite of stability in order to work. And really, I think the sort of doubleness here around abuse and its potential for harm is that all of these data points are used to create the possibility of gender affirming care, of going to a doctor or getting access to things like hormones and surgeries that help you feel more comfortable in your body, regardless of what your identity is. But they're also used at the same time as a blunt instrument and a bludgeon to force intersex and trans people into one of those two boxes, right? And so in that sense, I think we see that plasticity as such, which is sort of a real thing, it's a real observable quality of human life. It has no politics, right? Sometimes as feminists or queer, feminists or trans feminists, we think, instability, right? Ungovernability. These are cool, progressive concepts. It's cool to not obey rules, right? And plasticity really won't listen to anyone, right? As much as science and medicine have tried to learn how to control it, they always failed. Each chapter of my book documents moments in which plasticity, especially in children's bodies, disobeys all the people trying to control it, but it even disobeys the person whose body we're talking about, right? And in some of the most difficult cases in my book, trans kids really talk about sort of feeling betrayed by the plasticity of their own body. That is to say, going through a puberty that feels wrong, right? Or doctors in all sorts of horrific ways try to force intersex children to be male or female, and watches those bodies of those children refuse. Don't take on the hormones in a certain way, don't respond to surgeries in a certain way. But that wasn't the emancipation of those kids. It really, in many cases, was their torture because they weren't being involved in making medical decisions. So it's a really complicated concept with a really long history, but I think, again, it helps us understand that things are not always as they seem when it comes to sex and gender. We actually sort of have created this contradiction, this paradox that really works, where on the one hand, we acknowledge that there's nothing inherently binary about sex and gender because that's not how human life works biologically, right? I'm not saying anything radical here. This is like actually in the history of biology. It's like really conservative science, right? But on the other hand, there's nothing inherently emancipatory either about plasticity. The fact that we can transition and change sex and gender, to me, is not that remarkable. It seems like a pretty common thing in the plant and animal kingdom on this earth, but it has been weaponized against two groups of people in particular, intersex and trans people, at the same time as it has been used to support the vast majority of people, cisgender people, who actually are the largest consumers of gender affirming care. So that might be one way to sort of give a brief kind of synopsis of this concept, but we can keep talking about it.
Yeah, if you all are intrigued by this, you have to read Jules's book, because she has a brilliant way of weaving this term through all of the book. And I think it's why, I started thinking about the relationship of plasticity to fantasy and to play. But I think what you're talking about in relationship to body image and even, kind of our own selves being able to acknowledge our own plasticity plays into my next question. So I'm going to jump down to number 10. So this is a bit of a long question, but I want to be able to kind of describe to listeners a relationship that you call, quote, sideways growth, and the childlike, quote, passion for signification that you discuss, referencing Catherine Von Stockton when discussing a child named Vicky, whose letters to doctors you write about in chapter 4. What are the, quote, unanticipated lateral modes through which her trans body articulated itself without totalizing capture by the medical model? Can you explain this idea of growing to the side of cultural ideas, and how does it relate to body image in Vicky's case? You talk about her essentially starting to realize she's gaining weight. I'm wondering if you can talk about the way her body, as you write, signified between the fat and the feminine, and is that a way that she circumvented a norm of child development and a norm of transsexuality? How should trans children, especially trans girls and trans women, view their urges to conform with the feminine? And this idea, this impossible standard of the feminine that is, still prevalent today and a detriment to the health of so many women and girls. And, let's talk about that, and maybe I'll get in some of these other questions here.
Yeah, I love that connection. And, Vicky is this incredible trans girl who was growing up in rural Ohio in the mid to late 1960s. And I know about her because she wrote a kind of never ending, like 2-year long set of letters to the endocrinologist Harry Benjamin, this titan of transgender medicine, right? She probably found his name in a newspaper. Well, I think she found it from a friend who was also writing to him. But, if anyone read a newspaper article in the 1960s about trans people, Harry Benjamin would be named, and often his address was at the end of the article because he expected people to write him trans people who needed help. So Vicky starts writing in the mid 1960s as a 14-year-old, and was one of many trans kids whose letters to doctors I found in the archive. And she's just this incredible, expressive, tenacious, determined girl, because she writes to him the first time and she's like, hi, here's who I am. I'm 14 years old. This is what a transsexual is. I read about it. I'm one of those. And, I need help. She writes saying, I actually just need help explaining to my dad what a trans girl is, right? Because I want to transition. And it's like very standard, right? And of course, Benjamin writes back, as he did to all kids, and says, I can't treat you. You're not, you're under 18. You should just talk to a family friend or a psychiatrist, right? And he just basically brushes her off. And Vicky, plucky girl that she was like, well, that's not good enough for me. And she basically just keeps writing him for 2 years, even though every time she sends a letter, she gets another reply saying like, Dr. Benjamin's not going to help you. But, along the way, she just gives this incredible kind of account of her life, living in rural Ohio as a trans girl and, and going to middle and high school. And I talk about her through this frame of sideways growth, which, as you mentioned, is a concept that comes from my dear colleague and mentor, Catherine Bon Stockton, and her book, The Queer Child, just an absolute great companion book to mine. And really briefly, right, Stockton basically talks about how growing up, the idea of growing up that we have as the normative trajectory in our culture is actually really weird. Because the idea that children naturally grow towards things like heterosexuality, right? We might add here binary gender, right? Things that they have to grow up to be, but they're not allowed to be yet, right? Kids aren't supposed to be sexual yet, but we also have to guide them towards heterosexuality. It just creates this kind of bizarre paradox where the very idea of children's innocence has to contend with our intense need to sexualize them in order to lead them towards something we're very worried they won't otherwise do, right? If heterosexuality was really natural, we wouldn't spend basically 99% of our cultural energy anxiously trying to make sure kids turn out straight, and we wouldn't be so worried that they're not going to be. And so through that, Stockton ends up arguing that it's actually normal childhood that's the queerest thing, right? It's not just like gay and lesbian kids that are weird. It's actually all children. Our culture makes children weird and queer, right? And so if growing up is sort of a strange kind of, often awful event for most kids, she looks in this book at the idea of sideways growth, the moments when children, instead of growing up, kind of just spread out to the side, grow to the side of cultural expectations, get caught up in things they're not supposed to, or actually just kind of drift away from the scripts that adults kind of force them into. And so I wanted to take that up and look at it in a sort of strange case for Vicky, because Vicky's letters, right, are this interesting case study in what happens when we force trans children to wait. And this is one of the most common experiences of trans childhood for kids who know themselves to be trans and who start telling adults is they're told, wait, right? Harry Benjamin is telling Vicky, you are too young. I can't see you without parental consent. Wait until you're 18. And Vicky's like, why would I wait? I'm a girl. I don't want to wait to grow up to be a girl. I want to start growing as a girl now, right? Which means she wants to transition. And one of the things that she's really worried about is that she knows you can't just wait. What's waiting mean? It doesn't mean nothing happens. Waiting means going through puberty and growing more masculine in her body in the present day. And that's something that she tells Benjamin in her first letter is causing her deep depression. And one of the symptoms of her depression, as she narrates it to him, is that she's really struggling with emotional eating, that's her phrase, and she's really struggling with her weight. And she's been taken to her doctor, and her family doctors put her on a diet, and everyone in her life is trying to make her lose weight, and no one is letting her instead grow up as a girl. So there's this really difficult kind of almost poetry in her letters, where she's talking about another kind of paradox that we might call a paradox of the child's plasticity, right? Her body's in this period of exceptional growth. And so instead of growing up to be a girl and growing in a feminine way, she's feeling really upset to see her body growing, by her own estimation, fatter, right? And the growth of fat as this kind of socially stigmatized, as you were alluding to, form for everyone, but one that lands harder on women and girls, right? And so the kind of feminine ideal, whether or not Vicky wants to be it, she's just conscious of the fact that she feels like her body's betraying her, because she can't just put her growth on hold and wait until she's 18 and then start taking estrogen. If she doesn't start hormones now, her body will just keep growing, and her depression is also causing her to grow larger in a way that she feels, just sort of symptomatizes what she's not allowed to have. And so in that sense, I really kind of wanted to point to that as a really kind of painful form of an almost literal sideways growth, right? Her fear that instead of femininity, she's, experiencing a kind of growth in her body's size, right? And, it has everything to do with the relationship between fat phobia and the hatred of femininity, right? Our culture's general misogyny often manifests in that as much as we lift up and idealize femininity, it's usually in the context of openly hating it, right? Especially, by men. And I think that that's something that's particularly hard for trans girls, right? To negotiate at the same time, being deprived of access to a femininity that they know is already in a misogynist culture, but at the same time being trapped and feeling like their body is betraying them by growing in a different way. I mean, I think Vicky really bursts through the archive and testifies to how difficult that experience can be. And one of the reasons that I worked really carefully to write about it, and, actually really agonized about it because, Vicky's writing to this doctor. She's comfortable telling him, but, she never would have imagined that her story would be, make it into a book, and that, it gives me pause to tell her story, right? I don't know her, right? Vicky's not her real name. And, I don't want to stigmatize her further and suggest that there was something wrong, with her weight, or that there was something wrong with her desire to be a girl, right? I mean, I tried really carefully to write about her. I think she just testifies to us, though, how much we put trans kids through, especially girls. I mean, she talks about going to gym class and being paralyzed, being unable to move, because she's just so stressed out by this hyper-gendered, hyper-normative space. She talks about the bruises she had because kids beat her up. She talks about being ostracized and made fun of every single day. And she talks about feeling suicidal very frequently. I mean, it's really, really, I just think it's this vivid portrait of what we've done to trans childhood by kind of suspending it in these paradoxical spaces and saying it's okay to be forced to wait, that children aren't allowed to have things, that they have to survive their childhood in order to deserve to transition, or deserve to be feminine, deserve to have bodily autonomy. And I think as feminists, right, as people invested in these questions around the kinds of pressures put on girls in our culture, I mean, this is a cry out for help, and this is a call to arms, and this is a deep reckoning with, this whole category of girlhood that we are honestly not treating any better today than we were in 1968. So, in some ways, I thank Vicky for her incredible writing, but I almost feel ashamed, that our culture has to encounter her in order to hold up a mirror to ourselves and to ask ourselves, why do we do that to her? And why are we still doing that to so many girls like her today?
Yeah, I mean, I really thank you for including Vicky's story. I think it sort of opened up a lens onto a lot of things I've been thinking about in relation to women in sports, and especially trans women in sports. And in particular, I was thinking, especially in relation to Vicky and Vicky's growth, I was thinking of two trans women athletes whom I had heard interviewed. One is JC Cooper and the other Angel Flores. Both are women powerlifters, which of course isn't even another type of growth is necessary for this sport. And so both, I heard those interviews on a podcast called Burn It All Down, the feminist sports podcast you need is the slogan. Both JC and Angel talk about the irony of situations in which trans women are not allowed to compete or are presumed to have an advantage, when in fact, for both of these athletes, the hormonal replacement therapies they were undergoing, of course, had the opposite effect, which I think isn't shared enough in these stories, that you end up hearing in major news outlets, right? That the treatments that most trans women might be going through are extremely disadvantageous to building muscle because of the way they cut off the availability or creation of testosterone, which I'm sure you know more about than me. This history of medicine, is linked to this hormonal replacement therapy. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that medical history. I also wanted to bring it up because in Angel Flores' interview in particular, both these interviews were with Jessica Luther, I should note. Angel talks about the body image she struggled with before transitioning, and that she became interested in lifting weights because she was interested in bodybuilding and having control over the shape of her body. But she also discusses, after beginning to transition medically, the training issues she struggled with while undergoing hormonal replacement therapy. She had to work twice as hard as a cisgender woman to lift the same amount. My question is this: are the lateral moves you write of when you write about Vicky a bodily autonomy that can only happen outside of medical transition? And what do you think are the implications of these? In some ways, these powerlifters, I think they're women who are finding other lateral moves inside of medical transition. What do you think?
Oh, I love it. No, I mean, I think there's such, eloquent speakers, and I really commend them for being able to do something that so many trans women have to do these days, which is cut through extremely moral panic ridden, politicized discourse to tell the truth, right? A sheer amount of outright intentional lies about biology, hormones, and athletics, and then cultural lies too about what we think sport is for, right? That are circulating today. I mean, it's just staggering, right?
Yes, totally.
Right. It's like, oh, remember, of course, right? Sport is just about fairness. And it's like, wait, hold on. When has sport ever been about fairness in Western culture? Sport is literally about ranking human bodies by performance. Like,
yes, and fair for who?
Excuse me? And fair for who? Thank you. Yeah, and so, I think it's really interesting though, right? Because, there's one kind of response to the moral panic around trans athletes, especially trans women, because it's always a form of misogyny going on here, right? That we could just, sort of lump in with broader anti-trans politics and say, oh, well, this is just a convenient target for them, right? Because like sports is one of those weird, hyper segregated things in our society, kind of like bathrooms, right? Where, if people haven't had time to examine the issue, right, or it hasn't affected them in their personal lives, they probably haven't thought that much about it. And the appeal to scientific authority is so easy to make. And I'm talking not about like the appeal made by scientists, although there are plenty of kind of scientists complicit in these ridiculous, like fabulated protocols. So I'm talking more about people's appeal to the authority of like the biology I learned in middle school, or just whatever their common sense, understanding of sex and athleticism is, right? But as compelling as that explanation would be, where like, all these problems with trans athletes or problems that trans athletes are being made into is sort of just a symptom of something broader, I actually think that takes us further away from the central question. Like, why are we so hard on trans girls and women participating in sport? Why? Right? I mean, I think it's actually a question worth asking. I haven't heard anyone answer it, right? Other than like the kind of, well, they bring up anxieties, right? And I think there's something there, right? I think that, of course, as is often the case, trans women and girls in particular bring up anxieties for everyone else because they cause you to question, wait a minute, does it actually make any sense the way we organize and segregate and rank people in athletics and sports anyways? And the answer to that is like, no, like it's not actually based in science, it's based in custom, probably not customs that we like, right? Unfortunately, like with the segregation of public space, like restrooms, the history of sex segregation in sport has everything to do with the history of racial segregation and the spectacularization and anti-Blackness involved, around Black athletes. And so it's no coincidence that the women who are the most deeply policed in the arena of international sport are always Black and African women. And they're the ones that are accused of being men in this literally centuries-long history of accusing Black women of not being women, right? And so I kind of, I think one of the broader, reference points here that might interest folks is like, a really great book by Rebecca Jordan-Young and Katrina Karkazis, Testosterone, an Unauthorized Biography. They really look into this and they talk about how stories about that we tell in our culture about what testosterone is and what it does have almost no relationship to the science of testosterone, right? And I think that's what these power lifters are getting to, right? It's not just like sure, lots of cis people don't really know what hormone therapy does. And I think that's fine. Like no one's telling them, right? Like it's like on purpose that people are not like informed, but like the fantasies our culture has about whatever having had testosterone in your body does to you is hilarious. And like, I am not a professional athlete, but I will say as someone who biologically has zero testosterone in my body anymore and will never have any again, I because of the Omicron variant, had to take a break from going rock climbing for, about six weeks. And I just went back to the gym this week. And I was like, oh, I see, right? When you're a woman, when your body is dominated by estrogen, literally, if you stop working out, all your muscles disappear in a second. And I was like, wow, cool, thanks. So, I really think we have to question the cultural narratives we have around testosterone and estrogen, right? It's like scientists have known for a long time, testosterone is not a male hormone, estrogen is not a female hormone. Everyone generally has both in their bodies to wildly different proportions. And those proportions don't necessarily correlate to anything predictable in terms of performance, muscle mass, skeletal density. I mean, it's just not as simple as how we think, right? And so, I think one of the questions more broadly to understand in this moment is that, trans people are being targeted in organized sport because we really question the harm being done to everyone, right, through our classificatory regimes, right? And again, it's so telling that people like Castor Semenya, someone who isn't trans, is suffering too, right? It's not just transgender women. But I love the other part of your question, right? Because I think, one of the things that's happened here is that by treating trans people in sport as a moral panic and treating it as some sort of bizarre abstract question of science that actually has nothing behind it, we miss some basic questions like, why do people like sports, right? Why do we play sports in our society? Trans people aren't allowed to like athletics because apparently it's too threatening to cis people that we would be allowed to be on teams and enjoy ourselves and be a part of teams or just like enjoy exercise. And I've talked to other trans folks about this too, some journalists doing really great writing, I think, on this issue and trying to change that narrative, talking about like, for a lot of trans people, yeah, it's like, sure, you take hormones and you have your medical transition, but like that fast becomes pretty boring in your regular life. Like your body changes in major ways and then like you have your body, right? And so we're like anybody else, but that means for us, like coming to exercise can be a really important way of, like you were saying, imagining kinds of forms of lateral growth or maybe just bodily autonomy, right? A form of freedom in the body, a form of reclamation, a form of presencing in the flesh, a form of affirmation, a form of pleasure, taking pleasure in your own body. And I think for a lot of trans people, like that's not something that only trans people experience, but it really can mean a lot for some of us. Like for me, as someone who's experienced, forms of physical and sexual abuse and has PTSD, like exercising after transition has been so incredible because it's been a way of reclaiming my body. Like going rock climbing, which as a side note, seems to be a thing a weird amount of trans people like doing, is just like been so fun. It's been so meaningful to me to be able to go out and climb, because I always rejected those kinds of high octane, sort of powerful physical practices, because I associated them with masculinity. And learning basically to climb like as a woman or in my woman's body has felt just like so good and healthy for me. It's improved my health, not in just a literal sense, it's improved my self-confidence and my understanding of myself. It's a way that I'm learning how to be in my body and be a part of my body, and further integrate it into who I am. And so I think that that's something that a lot of people could relate to. But then again, to circle back, it's like, why are we depriving one group of people from access to bodily autonomy just because everyone else is forced to confront the contingency of their bodies too? But again, this is why, to me, trans issues are always so easily feminist issues. Like everything I just said about bodily autonomy, challenging stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, equal access, like these are core feminist planks. And, to my mind, it is so basically obvious that transgender women in particular ought to be in sport a central feminist issue, and they are for intersectional feminists, right? But for anti-trans feminists, it's like, wow, you're really selling yourself out and throwing away decades of activism just to try and secure what you think is your one little privilege. But really, it's not a form of privilege, it's a form of vulnerability. And I think as we try to expand the idea that people deserve that part of the dignity of living a human life is having as much autonomy and freedom in your own body, and in the way that you inhabit your body, then it seems to me that, part of demedicalizing gender in general, right, is also opening up other spaces where people are allowed to be in their bodies. It's a great privilege to be able to walk through the world feeling like you belong in your body. But I guarantee if I were to sit down with any non-trans person and talk to them long enough, they would come up with times where they felt uncomfortable in their body, they felt surveilled, they felt inadequate, they felt insecure. These are such widespread problems that deal with significant stigmas in our culture that I really think, once again, trans people offer a really rich insight, and we ought to be central in a kind of coalition of people who are reclaiming bodily integrity on feminist grounds more broadly. And so I really just, again, want to applaud these athletes who I think are just speaking so beautifully, and also, again, just dispelling the outright actual disinformation being circulated. The human body is an amazing thing. I will say this. Changing sex is wild and fascinating and very complicated. And so I don't begrudge that it's like not something that everyone understands. Like, even most trans people have to spend years learning about it. But I really think we need to raise the bar and demand more in these public conversations. We need to demand a lot more from people in charge of making policies. And we need to stop telling the grossest lies about the biological body. And we need to start thinking about what our core values are when it comes to bodily autonomy in sport.
Thank you so much. I'm so inspired by everything you're saying, and I'm also a rock climber. So
no way! I love it.
Yeah, and I used to live in LA, so I got into it there, and then recently like started again because I didn't get a gym membership like through the pandemic. But I felt the same way. I was like back to V1, like here I go. Like
that V1, yes. It's humbling. It is humbling. I saw those like higher levels I used to be able to do, staring at them and being like, okay, we'll see you again in a few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you're saying, like in particular, I just keep going back to the most recent news. Like, I don't want to harp on a specific story here because I think there are so many different stories where these issues are playing out, but the Penn case with Leah Thomas, and I'm disappointed in the press. Like, I don't see Leah Thomas statements anywhere. I'm hearing about the letter, and it's like, I like whose voice is being prioritized is like pretty upsetting in these cases where I think what you're saying about the expectation in sport around fairness. And then I was also thinking about, and science, like this our knowledge of science as if sports relies on that, just because there's like fancy sports technology and we're like taking times or like recording metrics. I feel like sports is all tied up in a pseudoscience that's just like someone's gonna beat you anyway. Like, like
Right.
always someone better.
Right. If athleticism is one of the ways that we have pushed the upper threshold of human performance with all of the baggage that entails, yeah, don't look at it for a reflection of like common sense notions. We are literally producing our beliefs about the human body out of sport. Yeah, and I think in this datafied kind of performance metric era and the sports technology era, right, that stuff has been heightened even further. And I just think like, and I really hear you on what kind of the way that the media has really not just dropped the ball, but is neglected to do basic due diligence here. And I just, every time these kinds of cases spring up around a person, I just think about what that means. Like for Leah Thomas, like, my gosh, how competitive is it to get a place on that team in the first place? People train for years. I mean, just the thousands of hours, the determination, the struggle to get there, right? And then to find out that having already gotten in, that your entire life can become a media spectacle, but no one's ever going to ask you how you feel. We don't pause to think about what that would feel like. Like, I just wish people would ask more. Would I enjoy it if I was at my job or in my workplace or at school and all of a sudden I was the subject of a smear campaign and people were trying to get me arrested for something that is completely normal, but also denies all of the hard work that I put in, right? That's the thing too about this question of fairness that's defined only in terms of some non-trans people's perceived threat is like, oh, so trans people just don't ever deserve ever to play on sports. That's these people's belief, right? Even though, as we know, it may in fact actually be much harder for them physically and biologically, never mind culturally and socially, to get there in the first place. So they're not entitled to that enjoyment. They don't get to be a part of it. And instead we get to vilify them. I mean, it's really very disturbing. And our kind of cultural stomach for that, I think, is something that really, it just really disturbs me. Yeah.
So throughout your history in your book, the reader begins to understand how little agency children have in the study of their own development and in the medicine that is supposed to be supporting them. Children, especially trans children, and especially trans children of color, are deprived of rights, are infantilized, are treated like the property of their parents and doctors, and are rarely asked to share their own stories, their own desires, or their own self-knowledge. Trans children are not listened to and not recognized. Actually, I was wondering, would you want to read this quote from your book? Okay.
Yeah, thanks for pulling this one out. So I wrote that childhood is already a very dangerous time and space for children in the United States. Trans childhoods, and so much more specifically, Black trans and trans of color childhoods, non-binary trans childhoods, low-income trans childhoods, disabled trans childhoods, and undocumented trans childhoods have been evacuated of formal meaning and abandoned by adults as less than human precincts. We make children vulnerable to the force of law, the deprivation of their economic earnings, and the infantilization of their personalities, only to raid their bodies, minds, and souls to enrich an order of things that cannot stomach their savvy and enviable divergences from normativity.
And you put something so sad, so beautifully, and I don't mean to, this is not to trivialize the seriousness of this, but it reminded me of the history of playgrounds, because that's where my research has been lately. And so I wanted to share that the history of public play spaces for children and the trajectory of play spaces throughout the 20th century, especially in the United States, is one towards taking away autonomy of children. And so in the design of public space, putting up fences, demarcating and designing designated spaces for children to play, making more and more rules and more safety regulations around both objects and sites for play, we have created the play space as like the carceral space. And I would argue it's not just children that lose in that history, right? We all lose in that scenario, including all of us that might want to use community space, and especially anyone without housing, or adults in less than ideal living situations lose. The policing around sports, as we've talked about, has similarly increased, trapping children and confining them to more and more rule sets claimed to create, quote, fairness, but fairness for who and at what price. Trans medicine, just like the design of play spaces and organized sports, would be radically transformed, you write in your book, by actually asking trans children what they want and truly basing care on that knowledge. You write, one of the historical problems endemic to Western childhood is that an abstract concept of the child has profoundly overlaid, sometimes overdetermined, the lives of actual children. The tension between abstraction and material life is precisely incorporated into the child as a strangely living figure. So my question is this: how might recognition of and freedom for trans children benefit the freedom of all children? So why should all of us be fighting for the freedom of trans children?
I love that question. For me, it takes me back to a kind of axiom of Black feminist organizing and of the Black feminist lineage out of which I derive trans of color feminism in my work. And this comes from the Combahee River Collective, writing in the 1970s, a beautifully trans-inclusive kind of vision of Black feminism. But one of the most provocative and frequently cited kind of things that comes from the Combahee River Collective statement in the 70s is this notion that if Black women were free, so too would everyone else be, because they have been placed at the bottom of a racial and patriarchal hierarchy in the United States and really globally, right? And I think that understanding of coalition, right, and of shared interests, but of prioritizing those whose experience of the lived world incurs the most harm, and understanding that their freedom is necessarily, by extension, everyone's horizon of freedom, is the only vision broad enough to counter the real dangers to not just everyone's freedom, but to things like democracy, public space, public institutions, right? That the march against trans children right now really condenses. And so I thank you for connecting the history that I write about to this history of playgrounds, because I think that sort of process, the loss of the public, right? The privatization of public space, loss of autonomy, the increased policing, and the ways in which public spaces that were supposed to be about the freedom and creativity of play have become more and more carceral, speaks to a broader kind of version of a number of things, right? The neoliberal torching of the public sphere, the destruction of public goods in this country, right? The rising wealth inequality that's come along with us, that's subject more and more people to forms of policing and incarceration than ever. And in many ways, the retrenchment of very limited rights that women and LGBT people had won, also voting rights and civil rights. We're really seeing a lot of democratic norms hanging in the balance here. And so one of the ways that I've been speaking about this lately that I think just actually takes all of this and condenses it into really kind of unambiguous terms is this. We've been facing down for over the last year an unprecedented onslaught of anti-trans legislation, most of it targeting children, right? Bills that we've been talking about, well over 100. Ones that weren't able to be passed in 2021 are now sailing through state legislatures. And we're just seeing the volume being turned up higher and higher, the rhetoric getting more and more violent, and we're seeing more and more retrenchments of rights, basic rights for trans people, the criminalization of their lives, and them being pushed out of the public sphere, right? What is this new vision for trans life? It's that you can't play on the sports team at school. In Florida, no one can say the word gay or trans in school. That's no longer allowed, right? So you basically can't get an equal education, right? And then And then what's going to happen? Well, you're going to have a hard time applying to college ever. You're not going to be able to hold down work if states have made it illegal to change your documents, as some states are now trying to do, starting with the prison population. So you can't change your gender marker, right? You're not going to be able to find secure housing. You're not going to be able to go to the doctor because that's been banned since you were a teenager. We are making trans life not only criminalized, we are kicking it out of the public sphere and privatizing it. So trans people will be pushed further underground and have less and less access to the basic rudiments of life. Why is that an issue for everyone? Because what are the other legislative priorities of these groups, right? Oh, repealing voting protections for African Americans, right? Making it impossible to have a free and fair democracy, right? And often getting rid of abortion rights. I mean, these are not coincidences. We're seeing this total abandonment of the idea of public health and the public good during the pandemic, when over 900,000 people have died. And instead of focusing on the abject failure of the state to care for its population, instead we're seeing these intensified retrenchments of basic civil rights and an anti-democracy strategy, right? And so I think, once again, it's like, if we build a coalition that is trans children, right, that is around Black voting rights, that is around abortion rights, then we have built a coalition that is broad enough and loud enough to challenge the wide swath, that targets these groups. And so just because each of those seem like so-called minority groups, I mean, hard to really think of them that way, honestly, but just because they get framed as single issues, well, they're not, right? And so when I think of that Black feminist imperative, to understand that when we attend to the people who are harmed the most and envision their freedom as our collective concern, and we're setting all of ourselves free, well, then I think, in that same way, when we work to greater autonomy for trans children, we're dealing with profound questions of how we hurt and harm children in general in our culture. All of these anti-trans initiatives will hurt non-trans kids too. You can't actually single out trans children from non-trans children. It doesn't really work that way. You can't tell who is who. We don't always know. People don't always know about themselves. And so I really think this is a moment to actually do something hard, which is to take the stack of crises that we are facing and flip them and say, yes, it's dire. Yes, things are bad, right? I woke up this morning to news that a beloved, young Black trans person in the UK was found dead today. And, every time we lose someone in our community, like, it hurts bad. These are not rhetorical questions, they're not rhetorical matters. These are life and death situations. But how do we pivot from always living in reaction to death and attack? And I think it's to turn around and say, when we lift up these people who are being hurt the most, and we see that we have to prioritize their freedom first, we are finally enunciating and envisioning a form of freedom big enough to challenge the forces that weigh down on us today. And so I think in some ways, loving trans children and taking care of trans children and championing trans children is one of the most empowering things anyone can do, right? And it's not easy, right? And when it comes to real kids in your life, you got to really think and challenge your own preconceived notions about them. But when it comes to a broader politics and the kind of horizon that I gesture to into my work, and I think that we've been talking about today, I don't think it's that complicated. I think we have the tools that we need. All we have to do is start listening to the people most affected. And I think we're going to find that we have all the ingredients that we need here, right now, today, to create a better world here, in the one that we are already living in, the one that we are already sharing with trans children, whether or not we choose to acknowledge that.
Thank you so much, Jules. I really appreciate all of your time today. I will wait for your lecture to ask you about Barbie's crotch. Definitely.
I love that. I look forward to us talking about Barbie's crotch in front of an audience. Yeah. Well, it's been such a pleasure, and I appreciate just the thoughtfulness, your understanding of the stakes and how human they are, but also how, because they're so human, we have to actually challenge ourselves to think complexly and not just choose the easy way out in thinking about, the real challenges we face and to really kind of stretch ourselves, right? And I think I feel excited to think about how questions of play and sport actually can, and our reactions to how they're being politicized today can really be strengthened by some of the insights in my book, even if that's not something that I wrote about. And in turn, that work that I'm doing feels, a little stronger and a little more fleshed out now, thanks to this conversation. So I really appreciate that.
This concludes the conversation between myself and Jules Gill-Peterson, Associate Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. This conversation has been sponsored by the Center for the Arts and Society at Carnegie Mellon University. If you'd like to check out what Jules has most recently been working on, check out Gender Underground, A History of Trans DIY. Here's Jules talking about this most recent project. Jules, if you wanted to share what your next book is about, we would all love to read it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, the more news, the merrier, I suppose. I'm sort of working on two projects right now, and one, a little bit longer probably before it comes out, but is a history of trans do-it-yourself transitions. So we've talked so much today about the institutional medical complex and how it's really limited and abused trans people. And so one of the things that I want to reckon with and tell a story about is actually most trans people don't go to the doctor to transition. They never have, and they still don't today. They don't have access, right? And so most trans people have actually transitioned, as we say, DIY. It's a really fascinating story that I tell from sort of the 1940s to the 1990s to really challenge the idea that medicine has a monopoly on trans people's lives, and to show actually that trans people are not just the experts in gender and in transition, but actually we have founded our own forms of vernacular medicine and have taken care of each other in amazing ways. So, at work on that, but in the sort of more meantime, I'm finishing a manuscript for a shorter kind of book that's going to be a little more accessible for activists and interested academics. That's called A Short History of Trans Misogyny, that really tries to understand and historicize and name some of these forces bearing down on us today, and saying, actually, there is a documentable thing called trans misogyny specifically, and it has a history that we could tell, but it's one that also helps us illuminate a history of resistance by trans women and trans femmes around the world, actually, to the kinds of hateful sort of violent forces that have tried to limit us and have tried to, again and again, often kind of convert our visibility or the desire for us into our undoing. And so it's sort of an impassioned plea for our moment, I think, but with some deep kind of historical resources, roots, and just the stories of some amazing trans women from all over the world that I cannot wait for people to meet. So yeah, stay tuned for those, coming on the whatever weird timelines that books come on.
Thank you. Those sound great. I look forward to them. I'll definitely check them out. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.